The station's emergency lights cast red shadows across the docking bay as Queen Zothra's warship settled onto the landing platform with a groan of stressed metal that made every technician in the area wince and step back from their posts. The Zothic, Empire's most decorated warrior, emerged from the vessel's main hatch, and the assembled crowd of dock workers immediately found urgent business elsewhere because nobody wanted to be near her when she was in this kind of mood. Her ceremonial battle armor, normally a gleaming masterpiece of living metal that shifted colors with her moods, hung damaged and dull across her massive frame like a dying thing that had given up hope. Scorch marks ran across the chest plate, where plasma fire had nearly breached the inner layers, and the left shoulder guard hung at an angle that made seasoned warriors who saw it feel phantom pains in their own bodies. But the real problem, the one that made Queen Zothra's mandibles click in frustrated rage, was the fracture running through the armor's core matrix where the living metal had been shocked into a kind of catatonic state that refused to respond to her neural commands. She had fought the Krell border raiders for 6 hours straight in that battle, taking hits that would have killed lesser warriors 3 times over, and her armor had kept her alive through sheer, stubborn determination, even as its systems failed one by one around her. Now, she stood on Meridian Outpost, a forgettable station spinning in the darkness between major trade routes, because this was where her damaged ship had managed to limp to before its engines gave out completely. The station master, a nervous Quellan whose eye stalks twitched with barely controlled terror, approached with the kind of careful steps someone might use when approaching a sleeping predator they desperately hoped would stay asleep. Your Majesty, the Quellan began, his translator device rendering his bubbling speech into flat galactic common. We are honored by your presence, but I must inform you that we have no master craftsman qualified to work on Royal Zothic armor. Zothra's growl started low in her chest and built into something that made nearby metal surfaces vibrate in sympathy with the sound. Then find someone who can at least stabilize it until I can reach the Imperial core worlds, she snapped, her secondary arms crossing over her chest while her primary arms rested on the hilts of her blade weapons in a gesture every species in the galaxy recognized as barely restrained violence. Station Master's eye stalks drooped in what his species used as an apologetic gesture, and he began scrolling through repair contractor listings on his datapad with trembling manipulator tendrils down in the lower levels of Meridian Outpost. In a section of the station where the air recyclers worked poorly and the lighting flickered more often than not, Marcus Webb was contemplating the very real possibility that his repair shop would not survive another month of operation. The human mechanic sat at his workbench, surrounded by half-finished projects and parts that had been sitting waiting for customers who never came back to claim them, running calculations on his tablet that all led to the same depressing conclusion about his financial situation. 3 years he had been on this station, 3 years of barely scraping by while alien customers looked at his human face and decided they would rather wait for someone from a species with a better reputation for technical work. It did not matter that Marcus had 20 years of experience, or that he had kept entire fleets of colony ships running during humanity's desperate push into contested space, or that he could diagnose a faulty gravity generator by the specific pitch of its magnetic whine. What mattered to most aliens was that humans were still the new kids in the galactic community, the upstart species that had bootstrapped themselves into space travel through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that maybe they should have stayed on their homeworld. His unit chimed with an incoming work order, and Marcus almost ignored it, because the last 5 work orders had been canceled before he even had a chance to review the specifications. But something made him check it anyway. Maybe just the bone-deep hope that keeps struggling people going, even when logic says they should give up. And his eyes went wide as he read the job description: Royal Zothic battle armor, full diagnostic and repair, emergency priority, payment terms negotiable. Marcus read it 3 times to make sure he was not hallucinating from the fumes of the chemical sealant he had been using earlier. Then checked the routing codes and saw that it had come through the station's automated contractor system somewhere in the bureaucratic tangle of Meridian Outpost's administrative network. A work order algorithm had sorted through available repair shops, and sent this job to him based purely on his listed qualifications and current availability without any regard. For the cultural complications, he should have declined it immediately, because even he knew that Jothic royal armor was sacred to their culture, and letting an outsider touch it was the kind of taboo that started blood feuds lasting generations. But Marcus looked around his failing shop, thought about the stack of unpaid bills growing on his desk, and made the kind of decision that desperate people make when they convince themselves that the potential reward is worth the obvious risk. He accepted the job and sent a message requesting the armor be delivered to his shop for assessment, then spent the next hour pulling up every technical manual and cultural database entry he could find about Jothic metallurgy and armor. Construction techniques. Armor arrived 3 hours later on a gray sled, pushed by a station cargo handler who looked profoundly relieved to be rid of it and left so fast he forgot to get Marcus's signature on the delivery confirmation. Marcus stood looking at the damaged armor laid out on his main workbench and felt a familiar flutter of excitement in his chest that he always got when confronted with a truly challenging repair job that would require every bit of skill and creativity he possessed. Living metal was unlike anything he had worked with before, a biological mechanical hybrid that blurred the line between organism and machine in ways that made traditional repair approaches completely useless. He spent an hour just observing it, watching how the metal's surface patterns shifted sluggishly in response to changes in ambient temperature and electromagnetic fields, building a mental model of how its systems must interact. Then he started working, not with plasma welders or molecular bonders, but with careful applications of specific electromagnetic frequencies and chemical catalysts that coaxed the living metal back toward active states. He treated the fracture in the core matrix like a traumatic injury to a nervous system rather than simple structural damage, using techniques borrowed from biomedical engineering to encourage the metal to begin its own healing processes. Marcus worked through the entire night and into the next day, sustained by coffee that was more stimulant than beverage and the deep focus that came from wrestling with a problem that actually challenged his abilities. When he finally stepped back from the workbench, the armor had transformed back into something alive and vital, its surface rippling with colors that shifted from deep purple to brilliant gold as its systems came back online one by one. He had done it, accomplished something that should have been impossible. And as he started writing up the invoice for his services, Marcus allowed himself a small smile of professional satisfaction. He had no idea that at that exact moment, Queen Zathra was discovering that her armor had been repaired and was working herself into the kind of rage that made battle-hardened warriors reconsider their career choices. Queen Zathra stood in her temporary quarters aboard the station, staring at her armor with an expression that cycled between disbelief and mounting fury so intense that the air around her seemed to shimmer with heat. The armor sat on its display stand looking better than it had in years, perhaps better than it had looked since the day it was first bonded to her in the royal forges of her homeworld. When she was barely more than a juvenile warrior, every system responded instantly to her neural commands, the living metal flowing across her body with the smooth precision she remembered from her youth before decades of combat had slowly degraded its responsiveness. Someone had not just repaired her armor, but had somehow improved it, addressing microfractures and stress points that her own imperial craftsman had declared unfixable without completely reforging the entire Passand. Nobody had asked her permission. Nobody had informed her the work was being done. And most importantly, nobody had explained how this was even possible when Geothic royal armor was supposed to bond only with royal blood. Her roar started as a low rumble that made the walls of her quarters vibrate, then built into a full-throated bellow of rage that echoed through the station's corridors and caused emergency systems to briefly activate in response to what they interpreted as a structural integrity alarm. "Who fixed my armor?" she bellowed in a voice that carried the kind of authority that came from commanding fleets and crushing rebellions and generally making entire star systems reconsider their political allegiances. Station Master received 17 emergency calls in the span of 2 minutes from panicked residents, who were convinced the station was under attack by something large and extremely angry. He checked his security feeds and saw Queen Zothra storming through the corridors with her full entourage of royal guards, and his eye stalks drooped so far they nearly touched the floor because he knew this was going to be the kind of diplomatic incident that ended Korea Sethra. Moved through Meridian outposts like a force of nature, her guards struggling to keep up as she followed the tracking codes embedded in her armor's delivery records. Back to their Sorsalians of a dozen different species pressed themselves against walls or ducked into side corridors as she passed, because even species that had never encountered the Jothic before possessed enough survival instinct to recognize an apex predator. On the hunt, she reached the lower levels, where the lighting was poor and the air smelled of recycled coolant and old metal. Following the tracking data to a shop front so unremarkable, she almost walked past if the sign read Webb's Repair Services, in both Galactic Common and several other major languages, with a subtitle that promised all systems, all species, fair prices, in letters that had faded from years of exposure to the station's artificial atmospheric. Zathras stood before the entrance for a long moment, while her guards took up defensive positions, and her primary tactical officer quietly suggested they scan for weapons or traps. Before she entered the premises, she ignored the suggestion and walked through the door, which chimed pleasantly to announce her arrival like this was some kind of casual shopping experience rather than what was about to become a very intense confrontation. Marcus looked up from the diagnostic scanner he was calibrating and saw the massive Jothic warrior queen standing in his shop, surrounded by guards who looked ready to turn his entire business into a smoking crater. He had seen enough combat in his years with the colonial fleet to recognize the specific kind of danger he was in. But he had also learned that showing fear to predator species was the fastest way to get yourself killed. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked in the same tone he might use to greet any customer who walked through his door, setting down his tools and giving the queen his full attentions as mandibles clicked in a pattern that her species used to express confusion mixed with escalating irritation. Because this was not the reaction she expected from someone about to face royal judgment. "You are the one called Marcus Webb?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a register that most species interpreted as an immediate prelude to violence. "That's right," Marcus confirmed, checking his tablet and pulling up a file. "And you must be here about the armor repair job. I have your invoice ready if you want to review the charges." The guards made small startled sounds because nobody talked to Queen Zothra like she was just another customer picking up a completed order, and several of them began calculating the fastest way to subdue the human before their queen decided to demonstrate why she held 17 personal combat decorations. But Zothra held up one primary hand in a gesture that stopped her guards mid-motion, her eyes narrowing as she studied the human who seemed either incredibly brave or terminally stupid. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she asked in a voice that had dropped to something quiet and far more dangerous than her earlier bellowing. Marcus considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to complex technical problems, then nodded slowly because he had spent the previous day reading about Jothic culture and had developed a pretty good idea of exactly how badly he had stepped in it. "I repaired your armor using techniques that your culture probably considers heretical," Marcus said with the kind of blunt honesty that humans were infamous for in diplomatic circles, "and I did a really good job of it." Which is probably making the situation worse. Zothra felt something shift in her chest that was not quite anger anymore, because the human's assessment was so accurate and delivered with such casual confidence that it triggered a response she had not felt in years: curiosity. "My armor should not respond to anyone outside my bloodline," she stated, watching the human's face carefully for any sign of deception. "My own master craftsmen have spent decades trying to restore its full functionality and failed. Yet you accomplished this in a single night?" Marcus gestured to the armor specifications still displayed on his workstation's main screen. Technical readouts that showed the living metals, biomechanical structure, and detail that made the guards exchange uncomfortable glances. "Your craftsmen were trying to Force the metal back to its original configuration, Marcus explained, highlighting several sections of the data. But living metal evolves over time. It adapts to how you fight and move. Trying to reset it is like trying to make an adult fit into their childhood clothes. He pulled up another screen showing the repair process he had used, a combination of bioelectric stimulation and catalytic compounds that encouraged the metal to heal itself rather than forcing. External changes, I treated it like a biological system that needed support to recover. Not a machine that needed parts replaced, Marcus continued, warming to his subject, the way engineers always did when discussing their work. The metal responded because I was working with its natural processes instead of against them. Zothra listened to the explanation and felt the pieces falling into place in her mind. Understanding spreading through her thoughts like light through darkness, her craftsman, bound by tradition and cultural expectations, had been trying to restore her armor to some idealized original state. Without understanding that the armor had grown and changed with her over decades of bonding, this human, unburdened by those traditions and approaching the problem with fresh eyes, had seen what her own people could not, you realize, Zothra said slowly, her tone shifting to something that was not quite threatening anymore. That what you have done could be considered a grave insult to my culture and my lineage. Marcus met her eyes without flinching, and she saw in them the same kind of calm she recognized from warriors who had survived enough battles to lose their fear of death. I realized that. Marcus confirmed. But I also realized that you came here looking for answers, instead of just having your guards shoot first. Which suggests you care more about results than tradition. Several guards made choking sounds because nobody talked to royalty like that and expected to survive the conversation. But Zothra surprised them all by making a sound that was very close to laughter. You are either very brave or very foolish. Human, she declared, then looked at the invoice still displayed on his tablet. What are you charging for this heretical miracle? Marcus told her the price, a figure that was reasonable for the work. Involved, but nowhere near what someone should charge for the kind of breakthrough. He had HFY transferred, triple that amount from her personal accounts without bothering to negotiate, then made a decision that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could predict. I have other equipment that requires repair, she announced, her tone carrying the weight of royal decree. Equipment that my own craftsmen have declared beyond hope. I want you to examine it. Marcus felt excitement building in his chest, because this was exactly the kind of challenging work he had been craving for 3 years on this boring station. When do you need it done? He asked, already mentally clearing his schedule now, Zothra replied, and gestured for her guards to retrieve the plasma glaive from her ship. Marcus smiled, and that smile carried just a hint of the same predatory confidence that the queen herself displayed. This was going to be interesting. The plasma glaive that Queen Zothra's guards carried into Marcus's shop was the kind of weapon that made experienced warriors take a respectful step backward just from being in its presence. Nearly 3 meters long, with a blade that shimmered with barely contained energy even in its inactive state. The weapon radiated the kind of power that came from exotic matter cores and engineering principles that most species considered theoretical at best. Marcus accepted it from the guards with careful hands that showed proper respect for both the weapon's danger and its obvious historical significance. Because even he could see the wear patterns that spoke of decades of combat use. My master craftsmen say the exotic matter core has degraded beyond recovery, Zothra explained, watching the human's face carefully for any sign that he was overwhelmed by the task she had set before him. They claim the weapon is now more dangerous to its wielder than to any enemy. Marcus set the glaive on his main diagnostic table and immediately began scanning it with every sensor array he had available, building up a comprehensive picture of its internal systems. The exotic matter core pulsed at the weapon center like a captive star, its energy signature fluctuating in patterns that his diagnostic software flagged as dangerously unstable. But Marcus had learned during his years keeping colony ships running that diagnostic software was often calibrated for ideal conditions and could miss the difference between malfunction and adaptation. He spent 2 hours mapping the core's energy patterns while Queen Zothra watched from a seat near his workbench that creaked under her weight. her guards standing at attention despite the obvious boredom. Of watching someone take measurements, your craftsmen are right that the core has changed, Marcus finally announced, pulling up a comparison between the weapon's current energy signature and its original specifications from the manufacturer's database. But they're wrong about what that means. He highlighted sections of the data where the core's output had shifted into new frequency ranges that fell outside the original design parameters but maintained stable patterns within those new ranges. The exotic matter hasn't degraded. It has evolved, Marcus explained with growing excitement as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in his mind. It has been exposed to your specific neural patterns and combat style for so long that it has adapted to optimize for your use. Zothra leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data with the sharp intelligence that had made her not just a warrior, but a strategic commander. But the power regulation systems fail whenever I try to use it at full capacity, she pointed out, gesturing. Two sections of the weapon's housing that showed scorch marks from internal energy discharge. Marcus nodded because he had noticed those marks immediately, and they had actually helped him understand what was happening inside the weapon's core because your craftsman kept trying to force the evolved core to operate within the original parameters, Marcus said, pulling up the weapon's regulation system schematics. It is like trying to make a river flow backward. The energy has to go somewhere, and it goes into melting your regulation circuits. He began running simulations on his workstation, testing different regulation configurations against the core's new energy signature patterns. What we need to do is redesign the regulation systems to work with the core's new properties instead of against them, Marcus continued, his fingers flying across his interface as he built new circuit designs. Let the weapon be what it has become, instead of forcing it to be what it was. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of careful disassembly and precision engineering as Marcus rebuilt the glaive's internal systems. Around its evolved core, he fabricated new regulation circuits using techniques he had developed during the colonial wars when human forces had to constantly adapt captured alien technology to work with their own power. System Zothra watched the entire process with an attention that made her guards nervous because they had never seen their queen so focused on anything that was not combat or strategic. Planning, she asked questions that showed a deep understanding of the engineering principles involved. And Marcus found himself explaining his reasoning with the kind of enthusiasm he normally reserved for talking to fellow engineers you were military, Zothra stated at one point. Not a question, but an observation drawn from watching how Marcus approached problems with the methodical efficiency of someone trained in combat engineering. Marcus paused in his work and nodded slowly, because there was no point in denying what she had already deduced from watching him work Colonial Fleet Engineering Corps. Marcus confirmed, 20 years keeping ships running in contested space where we face technology decades ahead of our own. He did not elaborate further, and Zothra did not press, both of them understanding that some experiences left scars that did not need to be discussed. Finally, Marcus stepped back from the reassembled weapon and activated its systems, watching diagnostic readouts that showed everything coming online. In perfect harmony, the glaive hummed with power that felt different from before, more focused and controlled. Even as the total energy output had actually increased beyond the weapon's original specifications. Try it, Marcus suggested, gesturing to the weapon with the confidence of someone who knew his work was solid. Zothra lifted the glaive and felt it respond to her neural commands with a precision she had not experienced since the weapon was first forged for her 3 decades ago. Plasma blade ignited with a sound like reality tearing, its edge so perfectly defined that it seemed to cut space itself just by existing in it. She ran through a series of combat forms right there in the shop, the weapon moving as an extension of her will with zero lag between thought and action. The power regulation held steady even when she pushed it to maximum output, the exotic matter core singing in harmony with her neural patterns in ways that made the weapon feel alive in her hands when she finally deactivated it. Zothra stood breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the sheer exhilaration of wielding a weapon that worked exactly as it should. This is better than it was when it was new, she said quietly. Examining the glaive with something approaching reverence, Marcus shrugged with studied casualness that did not quite hide his professional pride in a job done exceptionally well. It is what it should have been all along if someone had paid attention to how it was changing instead of trying to keep it static. He replied word of what had happened began spreading through Meridian Outpost's underworld within hours. Because stations like this ran on gossip and information trading, a human mechanic had not only repaired but improved Royal Zodic weapons. Using techniques that contradicted everything the galaxy's best craftsmen claimed was possible, Marcus suddenly found himself receiving inquiries from species that had never given his shop a second glance. Engineers and warriors who wanted to see if the rumors about the humans' abilities were truth. A Volok shipmaster who brought his supposedly unfixable navigation computer and watched in amazement as Marcus diagnosed and corrected an error that had persisted for 5 years. The Karathi merchant who had been told her cargo haulers' engines were beyond economic repair then saw Marcus rebuild them in a day using parts she had on hand. Its success brought more customers, and each customer brought more word of mouth that spread. Marcus's reputation across the station like ripples spreading across water, but not everyone was happy about the humans' sudden rise to prominence or about Queen Zothra's obvious favor toward someone outside her species in the shadows of the station's diplomatic sector. Representatives from a rival faction within the Zothic Empire watched reports of these developments with growing concern. They saw not just a human mechanic, but a threat to the traditional order that kept their own power secure. They began making plans, sending encrypted messages back to their supporters in the Imperial core worlds, preparing to eliminate this problem before it could grow into something that might challenge their authority. Marcus worked late into the night on a new project, completely unaware that his success had painted a target on his back that was being carefully lined up by people who had killed for far less threatening reasons. Queen Zothra returned to her quarters and found herself thinking about the human mechanic in ways that troubled her because they conflicted with everything she had been taught about humanity's place in the galactic order. She touched her repaired armor and felt its responsive warmth against her skin, physical proof that sometimes the galaxy's accepted truths were nothing more than comfortable lies. Change was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not, and that change wore a human face. Marcus was working on a particularly stubborn power coupling when his shop's security system chimed a warning that someone had disabled the external cameras covering his entrance. Years of military experience made him move before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. Rolling away from his workbench as the door exploded inward in a shower of metal fragments, 3 figures moved through the smoke with the fluid precision of professional killers, their weapons already tracking toward where he had been standing moments before as ethic assassins. Marcus's tactical mind cataloged automatically, noting the specialized armor that marked them as belonging to one of the Empire's Shadow Warrior castes. He grabbed the plasma torch he had been using and threw it at the nearest assassin, not to injure, but to distract, then vaulted over his workbench toward the weapons locker he kept in the back of his shop. The lead assassin fired a burst of plasma that melted a hole through his main diagnostic station, destroying equipment that represented months of savings. Marcus felt anger cutting through his fear because these people were not just trying to kill him but were destroying his livelihood. In the process, he reached the locker and yanked out the human-made plasma rifle he had kept from his military days, a weapon that looked crude compared to alien designs but had the virtue of being something he knew intimately. Assassins spread out with professional efficiency, using his own equipment as cover while they maneuvered for clear shots. Marcus fought enough battles to know he was outmatched in direct combat. So he did what humans always did when facing superior opponents. He changed the rules of engagement. His hand slapped the emergency containment release on the exotic matter storage unit he used for high-end repairs, flooding the shop with a pulse of electromagnetic radiation that scrambled targeting sensors and disrupted energy weapons. The assassins' plasma rifles sputtered and died, their sophisticated alien technology vulnerable to the very energy fields they relied on. Marcus's rifle, built with robust human engineering that prioritized reliability over elegance, kept functioning just fine. He dropped the nearest assassin with 2 shots to center mass, then dove behind a support pillar as the other 2 switched to conventional projectile weapons that did not care about electromagnetic interference. The fight turned into a desperate exchange of fire across his ruined shop, both sides looking for any advantage in the confined space. Marcus was calculating odds that were not in his favor when Queen Zothra walked through the destroyed entrance with her plasma glaive already ignited. She took in the situation with a single glance, saw the assassins wearing armor marked with her rival's house symbols, and understood immediately what was happening. The queen moved like violence incarnate, her glaive singing through the air in arcs that left glowing after images burned into the eyes of anyone watching. The assassins tried to adjust their tactics to face this new threat, but they had prepared to kill a human mechanic, not to fight one of the most dangerous warriors in the Jothic. Empiric Sethra S-blade caught the second assassin across the torso, the exotic matter edge cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease. The third assassin managed to get off several shots that scored hits against the queen's armor before Marcus's rifle fire stitched across his position and ended the threat. Silence fell across the ruined shop, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the crackle of damaged electrical systems. Marcus lowered his rifle and looked at Queen Zothra, who was examining the dead assassins with an expression that mixed fury with something that might have been sadness. They bear the marks of House Kreidel, she said quietly, her voice carrying dangerous undertones. My cousin's faction within the Imperial Court. Marcus checked his shop's damage with the numb assessment of someone who had lost things before and learned to deal with it. His main diagnostic station was slag. 3 of his specialized fabrication units were destroyed, and there was a hole in his wall large enough to see through to the corridor beyond. They came to kill me because I fixed your armor, Marcus stated, making it a statement rather than a question because the logic was pretty. Aviasathra nodded slowly, her mandibles clicking in a pattern that her species used to express both confirmation and disgust. My cousin has long argued that I dishonor our traditions by showing respect to species he considers inferior, she explained, her tone making it clear what she thought of that argument. Your success makes that argument harder to sustain. So he chose to eliminate the evidence. She looked at Marcus with new assessment in her eyes, seeing not just a skilled mechanic but a warrior who had held his ground against professional killers. You fought well, Zothra observed. Better than I expected from someone who claims to have left military service behind. Marcus set his rifle down and started assessing what could be salvaged from the wreckage, his hands moving automatically through familiar damage control routines. You do not really leave it behind, he said quietly. You just learn to pretend you did until situations like this remind you otherwise. Before Zothra could respond, new figures appeared at the shop entrance. These ones wearing the crisp uniforms of corporate security with logos that Marcus recognized from several major human industrial conglomerates. The lead security officer, a human woman with the cold eyes of someone who had done unpleasant work for a long time, smiled in a way that did not reach those eyes. Mr. Webb, she announced formally, I represent Meridian Industrial Solutions. We have been following your recent work with great interest and would like to discuss an employment opportunity. Her hand rested on her sidearm in a gesture that was not quite threatening, but definitely was not friendly either. Marcus looked at the corporate operators and understood immediately that this was not a job offer, but an attempted kidnapping dressed up in business language. They wanted his techniques, his knowledge of how to adapt and improve alien technology, and they did not particularly care whether he cooperated willingly or needed persuasion. Not interested, Marcus said flatly. Moving to position himself behind cover out of old habit, the security officer's smile faded into something harder and more honest about its intentions. I am afraid we must insist, she stated, and her team began spreading out with practiced coordination. Your techniques represent valuable intellectual property, and our company is prepared to compensate. You generously, Queen. Zothra stepped forward with her glaive still ignited, its plasma blade casting dancing shadows across the walls. He has already declined your offer, she said in a voice that carried absolute authority. You will leave now, or you will join the assassins on the floor. The corporate team hesitated because killing a lone human mechanic was one thing, but starting an incident with Jothic royalty was another matter entirely. The security officer calculated odds for a long moment, then made a decision that probably saved her life. "This matter is not concluded," she announced formally, then withdrew with her team moving in perfect defensive formation when they were gone. Marcus sat down heavily on a piece of debris that had probably been part of his storage system. Feeling the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once, "I built this shop because I wanted quiet," he said to no one in particular. "I wanted to fix things and be left alone and not deal with politics or violence or any of this." Zothra deactivated her glaive and sat down across from him, her massive frame somehow managing to look contemplative despite the gore still cooling on her armor. "You wanted to escape what you were," she replied. "Not unkindly, but excellence cannot hide forever. It draws attention whether we wish it or not." Marcus looked at his ruined shop and felt something shifting in his chest. Old walls he had built around himself starting to crack under the pressure of reality. "I was a combat engineer during the colonial expansion," he found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I kept ships running while we fought species with technology centuries ahead of ours. Watched friends die because I could not repair their systems fast enough." He stared at his hands, remembering all the things they had built and all the things they had failed to save. "When the wars ended and the treaties were signed, I took my discharge and ran as far from that life as I could," Marcus continued. "But I guess you cannot really run from what you are good at." Zothra listened without judgment, recognizing in his words something she understood from her own decades of warfare skill. "Is not a curse," she said finally, "but it is a responsibility. What we can do shapes what we must do." She stood and offered Marcus her hand in a gesture that crossed species. "Barriers through shared understanding. You cannot stay on this station now," Zothra stated with certainty. "My cousin will send more assassins, and your corporate friends will return with better preparation." Marcus took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. Accepting what he had been trying to deny, his quiet life was over. "Killed as surely as the assassins on his floor? What do you suggest?" he asked because he was practical enough to recognize when he needed help. Zothra's mandibles curved into what Marcus was learning to recognize as her version of a smile. "You come with me to the Imperial Core Worlds," she proposed. "We press." The Imperial Throne World of the Zothic Empire hung in space like a jewel carved from obsidian and silver, its surface covered in cities that had stood for millennia before humans had even discovered fire. Marcus stood on the landing platform of the royal palace, looking out at architecture that made him feel very small and very temporary, knowing that what he was about to do would either change everything or get him killed in extremely creative ways. Zothra stood beside him, wearing her repaired armor that gleamed in the light of the system's twin suns, looking every bit the legendary warrior that children across the Empire told stories about. "Are you ready?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Marcus adjusted the formal vest he had been given to wear over his work clothes. "The closest thing to proper court attire anyone could find that would fit a human frame." "No," he admitted honestly, "but I stopped being ready for things about the time assassins blew up my shop. So we might as well keep going." They walked together through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, past guards who stood so perfectly still they might have been statues carved from living stone. The Imperial Court Chamber was vast enough to have its own weather system, filled with Zothic nobles and warrior lords who represented the most powerful families in the Empire. The far end of the chamber sat Emperor Kaltos on a throne that looked like it had been grown rather than built, his ancient eyes watching their approach with an intelligence that had guided the Empire through 3 centuries of rule. Standing near the throne was a Zothic noble whose armor bore the symbols of House Krydel, Queen Zothra's cousin and the leader of the faction that had sent assassins to kill Marcus. Lord Sevkri watched them approach with barely concealed hostility, his mandibles clicking in patterns that his species used to express contempt. "Your Majesty," Zothra said formally, bowing with the precise depth that protocol demanded, "I bring before you Marcus Webb, human mechanic and master craftsman, who has accomplished what our own artisans declared impossible." The Emperor leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixing on Marcus with an intensity that made the human very aware of how many ways this could go wrong. The human who dared touch royal armor. Emperor Kaltos said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "We have heard many reports of your work. Some praising your skill, and others calling for your execution." Lord Sevkri stepped forward before Marcus could respond. His voice sharp with accusation. "This creature has violated sacred traditions that have guided our empire for thousands of years," the noble declared, addressing the emperor, but speaking loudly enough for the entire court to hear. "He has contaminated royal artifacts with his alien presence, and Queen Zothra has encouraged this sacrilege by refusing to punish him." He turned to face the assembled nobles, playing to the crowd with practiced political skill. "I call for this, humans. Immediate execution, and for Queen Zothra too. Undergo ritual purification to cleanse the dishonor she has brought upon her lineage." Sev, Kree announced formally, invoking ancient laws that gave him the right to demand such things. Murmurs spread through the court as nobles began calculating the political implications and choosing which side offered the best advantage for their own interests. Marcus felt Zothra tense beside him, but the queen remained silent, trusting him to handle this the way they had discussed during the journey to the throne world. The human stepped forward with the same calm confidence he brought to complex repairs, treating the hostile court like any other technical problem that needed the right approach. "Lord Sevkri is correct that I violated your traditions," Marcus stated clearly, his voice carrying across the chamber with surprising strength. "I did touch royal armor without permission, and I did use techniques your culture considers forbidden." The noble's mandibles curved into a satisfied smile because he had expected the human to deny everything or make excuses that would be easy to tear apart. But Marcus was not finished talking, however. The human continued. "Lord Sevkri has made a fundamental error in his understanding of what actually happened, because he assumes that breaking tradition is the same as causing harm." He gestured to Queen Zothra and her gleaming armor that responded to her slightest thought with perfect precision. Queen Zothra's armor had been deteriorating for decades despite the best efforts of your master craftsmen, Marcus explained. "Not because those craftsmen lacked skill, because they were bound by traditions that prevented them from seeing the real problem." He pulled out a data tablet and projected technical schematics into the air above the court. Images that showed the armor's living metal structure in detail that made several nobles lean forward with interest. "Living metal evolves and adapts over time, but your traditions demand that it be maintained in its original state," Marcus continued, highlighting sections of the data that showed the conflict between evolution and tradition. "Your craftsmen were trying to force the metal backward instead of helping it grow forward." Emperor Kaltos studied the projections with the sharp attention of someone who had not survived 3 centuries of rule by missing important details. "You are saying our traditions were harming our own technology?" the emperor asked, his tone impossible to read. Marcus met the ancient ruler's eyes without flinching, because he had learned in the military that authority respected confidence more than deference. I'm saying that traditions are tools for preserving knowledge," the human replied carefully. "But when tools stop serving their purpose and start causing damage, wise people adapt their tools rather than clinging to them out of pride." The court erupted in shocked conversation because nobody talked about sacred traditions like they were mere tools to be evaluated and changed. Lord Sevkri seized on the chaos, his voice cutting through the noise. "This proves my point exactly," he declared triumphantly. "The human seeks to corrupt our culture and replace our ways with his inferior alien thinking. He must be eliminated before his poison spreads further." Marcus turned to face the hostile noble directly, making a decision that was either brilliantly bold or catastrophically stupid. "Lord Sevkri claims I want to replace your traditions," the human said clearly. "But what I actually propose is something your culture seems to have forgotten." He gestured to the technical data still hovering in the air above the court eye. "Propose teaching your master craftsmen the techniques I used. Not to replace your traditions, but to enhance them," Marcus explained, his voice gaining strength as he committed fully to the idea. What you see as contamination could become evolution. What threatens you could make you stronger. He looked at the Emperor and made his final argument. Humanity survived against species with superior technology by learning to adapt and improvise, Marcus stated. We did not abandon our own knowledge, but we were willing to combine it with anything that worked. Regardless of where it came from, the human paused to let that sink in before delivering his conclusion. Queen Zathra showed that same willingness by accepting my help despite cultural taboos. And she gained an advantage that your traditions alone could never provide, Marcus said. The question is whether your empire has the strength to do the same, or whether you will let pride make you weaker. The chamber fell silent as nobles processed what amounted to a direct challenge to the empire's fundamental cultural assumptions. Emperor Kaltos sat, motionless on his throne for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the ancient ruler began to laugh, a sound like grinding stone that started low and built into something that shook the chamber. You are either the bravest being I have ever met, or the most foolish, the Emperor declared. Perhaps both, which may be the most human thing of all. He stood from his throne with surprising grace for someone so ancient. Descending the steps to stand before Marcus and Zothra, 3 centuries I have ruled this empire, Emperor Kaltos said. 3 centuries of watching us grow stronger, and then plateau. Unable to advance because we became too comfortable in our superiority, he looked at Lord Sevkri with eyes that had seen through countless political schemes. My cousin raises armies to oppose this change. Believing that tradition alone will protect us, the Emperor continued. But I have lived long enough to know that civilizations that cannot adapt eventually fall to those who can. The ruler turned back to Marcus with a decision made. I name you the first non-Jathic master craftsman in the history of our empire, Emperor Kaltos declared formally. You will train our artisans in your techniques, and they will teach you our deepest knowledge. Together you will forge something greater than either could achieve alone. Lord Sevkri's rage was visible in every line of his body as he realized the Emperor had outmaneuvered him politically. This is madness, the noble hissed. The other houses will never accept it. They will rise in rebellion rather than submit to this humiliation. The Emperor's smile showed all his teeth in an expression that reminded everyone present why he had held power for 3 centuries.